role that the church played as I grew up. It was everything from the moment I can remember, childhood memories of primary. We never missed church. Even when I broke my leg in third grade, I still made it to church in my shorts. I remember there was a lot of pressure from my dad for us to basically be perfect in public.
Almost every young man, especially in my generation, has struggled at one point or another. And the biggest thing in the church is that it's not talked about. We just have these people that we think everybody's living these perfect lives, and that's not the case. And it's not the shame. The shame doesn't come from talking about it. The shame comes from not talking about it, actually. My parents say all the time that the LDS Church is a church of blood because my parents were converts. And so they did all the dirty work, and all the people with the big names and the big money, they just kind of got to cruise and tell people what to do. That's not how God's church would function. Like, everybody has a part, everybody has something to offer in God's true church, and that's not what the LDS Church is doing.
Everybody always makes the excuse, well, the members aren't perfect. That's fine. I can deal with imperfect members, but an institution that doesn't protect its members and is in fact actively working against protecting it in the way that I see the policy that they implement or don't implement, that was where the wall started crumbling down.
There's no safety for people in the church, and you just do what you're told. And that's a really big issue, because I think there's more safety in the church for people who are committing grievous abominations. There's more safety for them than there is for the innocent and the weak who need to be protected.
I'm done being in an organization that will not protect the weak, will not protect the helpless, will not protect those that Christ would protect, and do everything in his power to protect.
Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest was James Bradshaw. Guys, this episode this week was fire. You're not going to want to miss it, because James talks about everything from health and living in alignment with our spirits and our bodies to abuse that's going on in the church and what eventually led to them leaving the church altogether. So you guys are not going to want to miss this episode. Stay tuned for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they're walking. And along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest is James Bradshaw. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Thanks for having me, Claire.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I had an awesome opportunity to talk to James yesterday, actually. Which is pretty rare that I get someone on the podcast this fast after talking to them. So one win for the Clarity Podcast here. But we're so glad that you're here, James. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and where you're from.
So I am from originally California, San Diego, grew up there. I basically grew up there until 2001 when I moved up here with my wife to Utah. I'm currently living in Provo. We came up for graduate school and basically been here ever since. I've raised all my children here in Utah. I have two wonderful daughters and two amazing boys. And we're a pretty happy family. We've had a lot of experiences and trials, and I'm glad that our journey has taken us to where we're at right now. And family is the most important thing to me. And a lot of what I've gone through in my life is centered around that. It's centered around my wife and my children. I've been married 25 years. Well, she would say that we're on our 25th year. So I always mess that up because we got married in 2000. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So you're living in the heart of Mormonism, Provo. That's quite the place to live when you're in this place that we're in. So we'll get into that as we get further into the interview. Okay, so before we get into that, let's go ahead and jump into your childhood. So tell us the part that the LDS Church played in your childhood and what that was like growing up in the church.
So I was born and raised in the church. I'm from a family of 11 children. So I'm the seventh of 11, mostly boys, 9 boys, 2 girls. So a lot of bumps and bruises growing up in such a large family. But in terms of the role that the church played as I grew up, it was everything. It was from the moment I can remember, childhood memories of primary. We never missed church. Even when I broke my leg in 3rd grade, I still made it to church in my shorts. And so I think there was one Sunday that I missed because I was so sick. But even then, I felt guilty for not going. I was pretty young, but never missed church, never missed family night. I mean, crammed 13 people, my parents and all 11 children, in a decent sized room, but never missed family night. Grew up as the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants is part of our scriptures. So whenever we did scripture study, those were always part of it. In fact, we were pretty competitive with my siblings. And so we would have competitions on Sunday where we just open up the Book of Mormon and start reading. And whoever could find where the person was reading first won, and then they'd go on to the next. We would have to trip each other up by going into 2nd Nephi and 3rd Nephi, where the Isaiah chapters are, because that always messed us up. We didn't know where in 2nd Nephi it was and all of that. If we went anywhere else, we were pretty good at it. So it was a lot. I remember a story when I was in primary where we were doing some things on the 10 plagues, and someone from the stake presidency came in, and they were watching. My mother was the teacher at that time doing sharing time, and they had people going up doing Pictionary. And I remember when my brother went up, she's like, "Sorry, I don't have a green pen," and I just yelled out, "Plague of frogs," and then she's like, my mother just gave me this glare, like, you messed it up, She's like, "Just draw a frog," and so he went and did that, and I remember I overheard the conversation where the stake leader was just like, "Are all of your primary kids like that?" She's like, "No, just that one," And so my mother, she was wonderful, but I was very exuberant. And so, I even remember a story too of when they were planning the San Diego Temple when we were in primary, and we had a picture of or a 3D model of the LA Temple, and they had us bring our quarters and our extra money in, and every time we would get a quarter, they put a sugar cube to try to cover it because we were raising money for the San Diego Temple. It wasn't till like 12 years later that it was built. But I remember that. There's not a lot of childhood memories that I have in primary, but there's several of those that are central to that. And I share that because it comes up later when we talk about the San Diego Temple.
Okay.
But this is, being in California, we had early morning seminary. We get up at 5:30. My mother was the seminary teacher for all 4 years, and so we never missed any seminary. But she was amazing. She really taught it so well that we had people from other seminary classes coming into hers and skipping out on their others. It actually, kept growing and growing. We would have annual scripture chases. I don't know if I didn't hear that they had them up here in Utah. I asked around, and they're like, "What's a scripture chase?" And you just get people from different wards, and they would have the scripture masteries from seminary, and then they would give like a little piece of it, and they'd have everybody look it up, and you had to get it within 10 seconds. So we would have these competitions just at the end of the seminary year so that people would be able to get together in a spirit of friendly competition. Well, it turned out once my mother became seminary teacher, we started winning every year. Like our seminary class started winning. We were nobodies. We were nobodies out on the edge of the stake. We always lost the basketball games. We were nobodies, but we were the champions of scripture chase. And it got so bad. When I say bad, I mean it got so competitive that other bishops started offering their seminary students, money to beat us. So it got to the point where when my dad was in the stake presidency years later, he basically said, "We have to shut this down. It's too competitive. It's too too much animosity. So
Mm.
that, yeah, that was just to give a general idea. We were raised in the church. We were full in. My dad was the bishop from ages when I was 12 to 18. So it was our entire lives.
Okay.
Um, we weren't lazy at all in our devotion or our religion or whatnot.
Okay.
This was also when I was a teenager, the time that Prop 8 came out. And we might talk about this later, but the church was heavily involved in that. They may say to the otherwise, but I remember quite a few members kind of saying, should the church really be this involved in going out on this issue for politics and all of that? And we went door to door. We had all the resources we could want to do so. So it was heavily supported by the church. I don't know what they talk about today with that, but I
Mm.
remember going out with my mother door to door, and it was very church organized to do so. So that's
Okay.
just kind of some anecdotes of my childhood growing up. Of the church was everything.
Mhm.
We did everything around that. So.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of dive into your teenage years, being a young man in the church. What was that like for you? And what was it like as far as callings you had and activities you went to? What was the leadership like? Share some of those things with us.
So I I pretty much had one calling. As no, I had a couple callings, but my main calling was priesthood pianist. I played the piano since I was 8, and so they never bothered to call anybody else. And I'm sure they got tired of me, but I played every hymn in the hymn book, had them all memorized, and could jump in at a moment's notice and say, "Let's sing, this hymn for this session and whatnot." So I, for all of my teenage years, was the pianist. They did have me have those callings of being the deacon's quorum president, teacher's quorum president, first assistant to the bishop and priest quorum. And so we were a smaller ward. And so everyone that wanted to essentially got some of those roles. I know some bigger wards, not all the youth tend to get some of those leadership roles. But with my dad being the bishop from age 12 to 18, it made it difficult because of the issues that I dealt with as a teenager. And I don't know if we want to go through some of those now or talk about them later.
Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into tell us some of the things you struggled with when you were a young man and maybe what that was like when you were a teenager. Okay, so I was a bishop's kid from age 12 to 16, 15.
Mhm.
It was really hard. It was really hard. So tell me what that was like for you.
Yeah, everyone was always looking at you, ready for you to make a mistake, and then jump on that to talk about my dad as the bishop, or to say, well, your kids aren't perfect, and so mine get a free pass. And um, I remember there was a lot of pressure from my dad for us to basically be perfect in public. And I I struggled with pornography in my youth. That was a really difficult thing because I just kept it hidden from my parents. I couldn't go to my dad, who was the bishop, talk to him about it. He had already, by the time that I was a couple years into it, that's when the first time he even talked to me about it. And he's just like, this is not right. And I'm like, wow, well, this would have been great beforehand, but they weren't really good at prepping us for things. They always said, oh, he's 13. He's probably at the age of maturity. We'll talk to him now about that. I'm like, you're 2 years late. And I remember just the guilt and shame growing up because um, I was always looked at as there's there's a future missionary, there's a future, everyone had this view and perception, but inwardly I was just like, if you really knew me, you'd know what a sinner I was. And it was very difficult to find any help because I didn't trust anybody to not look at me as I was. And again, that perfection with my father being the bishop, it was just something that had to remain hidden for all that time. And I couldn't get any help or resources for it. I mean, they gave pamphlets and booklets, but those weren't really helpful at all. So I grew up with a lot of guilt and shame, became very difficult to overcome, especially in my early years of marriage.
It's a really common struggle, even if your dad isn't a bishop. I think almost every young man, especially in my generation, has struggled at one point or another. And the biggest thing in the church is that it's not talked about. And so we just have these people that we think everybody's living these perfect lives. And that's not the case. And it's not the shame. The shame doesn't come from talking about it. The shame comes from not talking about it, actually.
Right.
And that's
Right.
where the flaw is in the church. And if we could just openly talk about it, I think we would be empowering the young men and the young women who struggle with it to overcome it. But we're just not
Yeah.
doing that. We're just keeping quiet and hiding. And that's
Yeah.
makes the
I had a
struggle.
lot of brothers that struggled with it too. I had firsthand knowledge that they dealt with it as well. No one talked about it in our family. No one, I mean, we could have had so much support with so many boys that were siblings that could have helped each other, and older generations helping younger. And we just didn't discuss it. It was not appropriate to do so in any setting except sitting down with your bishop, right? There was no other thing outside, and I was not going to do that with my father growing up. And um, I definitely felt a complete lack of support. Like the only support I got was that Packer handbook that was given to young men that talked about how it was, they're like, this is a sin that's pretty close to murder. So, it was, there was so much put on us. Now, today, people talk about it and they're just like, oh, it's nothing. But I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm saying, but back in the day, it was a big deal, and I didn't feel like I could go to anybody for that. My wife was the first one that I went to for real help. I did go to a bishop right before my mission to get things in order because I knew I'm like, there's no way I'm going on a mission with this as an issue. But since my dad left and we got a new bishop in, I had a year because this is back when you'd be at 19 years old when you went. And I'm like, I'm going to work with them for this year. And I did. And I talked with my bishop, got some pretty good help, but most of the help came from Jesus. Most of it came from my personal relationship with Jesus and not any of the support that the church gave. And I attribute that to him because I went years without struggling with it again during my mission and even years after my mission. It resurfaced again in the early years of my marriage. And then we really hit it hard and worked on it to where it no longer became a problem. But I was always fighting it. But that was one of the things I found that was lacking in the church was the support for that. And I think still is today.
Definitely. Well, and it's like you said, the dynamic has changed a little bit. And that now it's kind of like, oh, you just need to go to the temple more and you'll feel better. When it used to be like, you couldn't go to the temple if you had that struggle. And so
Yeah.
there's still no help, but it's just kind of thrown under, it's like every guy does this. It's just normal. And
Yeah.
I don't know why that's a message because it's totally lies. So,
Yeah. It
mhm,
doesn't have to be normal. That's something that I've learned later in my life. It does not have to be normal. You don't have to accept it. It's something that should be eradicated and should be fought at all costs. And there are ways to overcome it. There's some that are more difficult than others, but there are ways if you're willing to do so.
mhm.
I found a lot of those solutions later on in my life as well, and I'm currently trying to help those that struggle as well to overcome it as well because it is possible. It's
That's
very
awesome.
possible.
I love that message. Okay, so I wanted to transition into your mission and meeting your wife, and then I want to talk about kind of how you overcame it, and we'll talk about that. So
Absolutely.
let's talk about mission first. Tell us about your mission.
Yeah, I thought I was ready. I read back in the day there were about 5 missionary books. I read all of them twice over. Um, I even rode to the temple. This By this point, the San Diego temple was built, and I rode my bike twice a week, which took me an hour because I didn't have a car. But I would go to the temple twice a week. I'd do about 2 sessions each time I go because I wanted to make it worth it. Really, really got ready and mentally prepared for it. My family, obviously, with a large number of boys, I was the sixth boy to go on a mission, and we had a nice plaque set up on the wall. No pressure, right? In terms of all the previous missionaries, we had a central map where the pins were in, and our mission calls and all these things. And so I wanted to go on a mission. I have to make that clear. I was not pressured by my parents to go on a mission. It was something I was looking forward to my whole life, um, and so when I got on my mission, first in the MTC and then out, man, was I surprised at. I had five brothers before me tell me all sorts of stories. I was not ready for it. I thought I was. Um, I I think the hardest thing for me wasn't the work. It wasn't preaching the gospel. It wasn't sharing my testimony of Jesus. It was the I want to call them men, but they were boys that I served with, because you give them a little bit of authority. It's like the scripture said. It goes to their head, and they're the same age. They have the same background as you. We're all in here, but they've got that little bit of authority, and that was the most difficult part of the mission for me. I had two companions. One is I don't know if I want to say their names, but one is the nephew of a current apostle. I believe he was an apostle at the time as well. He was the worst. he he basically emulated what we see in the church today, where I'm the authority, I'm telling you what to do, you need to follow what I'm telling you to do, whether it jives with what you want or not. I remember I have a light sensitivity, and so I would read the scriptures early morning when the sun was coming up. Very relaxing for me, very enjoyable. And he came in and saw me reading in the low light, flips the light on and starts yelling at me. And he's just like, "What are you doing, Elder Bradshaw?" I said, I'm reading the scriptures. He's like, "If you read in low light, it's going to hurt your eyes and it's going to damage them. And you need to stop doing that." And then he walked out and left the light on. Well, I did it the next morning. I just was watching that, reading the scriptures. He comes in, he's like, "I already told you yesterday that you shouldn't read with the low light on. You need to repent." He actually told me that I needed to repent because I didn't do what he said. So
Isn't he
that's
like
just one
the same age as
example.
you are? Like,
Was that?
isn't he like the same age as you are? And
Oh
he's
yeah,
an elder
absolutely. He
on a
might have been a
mission.
few months older than me because he was my senior companion. But um, there were times where he's just like, this companionship's like a marriage. I'm like, "Okay, then give me your money. I'll do all the shopping and cooking for us." But I'm like, if you get to keep your money and because he would eat my food, and he would cross all these boundaries. That was what made it really difficult. And I was homesick. To be honest, I had never been away from home. So to compound all of those, I struggled. Almost 3 months into my mission, I was ready to go home. And remember, I had that vision of the plaque on the wall of my parents. Like there was no way. So I had to tough through it. And again, there were days where I was on my knees for hours pleading to God, and He got me through it. He was the only one that got me through it. Nobody else did. Um, so I had another companion who was a direct descendant of Brigham Young, which he much acclaimed his heritage to. Yeah, he was pretty proud of it. He didn't like the idea that I said, "Yeah, you and about 10,000 other people," but he I was a little smart aleck at the time, but
But maybe
it
they
was,
needed that. Like, maybe
yeah.
they needed someone to stand up to them.
Well, I think people really did give him a lot of respect because of his last name being Young. They're like, "Wow, you're a descendant of Brigham Young." He got a lot of admiration for it. It was
Yeah.
quite interesting
My
to
parents
watch.
say all the time that the LDS Church is a church of blood because my parents were converts, and so they did all the dirty work, and all the people with the big names and the big money, they just kinda got to cruise and tell people what to do, and it
Yeah,
just that's not how God's church would function. Like, everybody has a part, everybody has something to offer in God's true church, and that's not what the LDS Church is doing.
right, right.
Mhm.
I actually had a companion that had a mental disorder, schizophrenia. I got along with him better than those other companions, but I'm not a
Yeah,
stranger to mental illness, so I understood his plight, and
mhm.
we got along great. We had a lot of fun,
That's awesome.
but yeah.
That's so awesome. Okay.
So
So
those were
then,
the highlights. Everything else is pretty much just hard work and
mhm.
blood, sweat, and tears.
So were you able to overcome the pornography for the time of your mission, or like was that a struggle during your mission?
No, I after my dad stopped becoming bishop, and we got a new one in, I immediately went in because I knew it might take some time. Took us a couple months for me to break the habit. And then I spent the following year in preparation. My mind was so hyper focused, it wasn't even a temptation. So during that time, I had purpose, I had meaning, for that year. I was doing some college in preparation, but for when I got back, so just simple classes and whatnot, nothing too heavy. And then on my mission, never had any problems either. Was able to go all 2 years, and even when I got back, I was still very much on fire with the hard work ethic. Got into college, didn't have problems for years. So it was something that I'm like, yeah, this is good. I beat this. I don't. It's not going to come back to haunt me. Um, I was very happy because of how long I'd suffered for it. So I went years without any relapse or any going back to it. But as I mentioned, it wasn't because of any help my father gave me. It wasn't any of the support from siblings. Even within my family, it was still kept a secret. My dad knew that I was working on it at that point. I never understood this part. When I talked to the bishop and we were going through this process. Obviously, my dad knew I was meeting with the bishop, and he was kind of interested and concerned. I'm like, it's fine. It's the bishop, Dad. You and I have a relationship. This is me and the bishop. And at one point, the bishop's like, you need to tell your father. I'm like, why? Why do I need to tell my father? What? It's not like I hurt him. At this point, I was basically hurting myself. Um, but I went and did, and of course, he reacted the way I knew he would. Just My dad is notorious for lecturing for hours and hours, and I think I got probably a 4 or 5 hour lecture. And the If anyone asks my siblings, those are notorious lectures, and everyone steers clear of my dad's bedroom when you're in the room, and he's not yelling, but you are made to feel this small. And it never helped the relationship that I had with my father from that. So I never went back to him for help regarding those types of things. I did have some young men leaders that I never talked to about, but they were kind of like father figures to me. They were very understanding. We never talked about my pornography problem, but they were there in a way that I knew that if I really started having some issues and struggles with other aspects of my life, it felt comforting to know. It's not something I generally see today. I haven't seen it here in Utah because raising my kids, I've actually seen the opposite. So that's something that is part of our exit, as I'll get into later. That made it easier to say what good is being done, and we struggled to find it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay. Okay. All right. So you get home from your mission, you're doing good. So what was like your breaking point that made you relapse into the addiction?
um, after I got married, um, sometimes a guy just thinks, oh, I'm married. I won't have that problem anymore because I have a loving wife, a loving relationship. But as married couples learn, the wife needs to feel safe, secure, comforted. And sometimes there's an intimacy rejection. And in that intimacy rejection, it can be difficult for, my early years of marriage. I took rejection pretty hard. Now she wasn't rejecting me, obviously, but I perceived it as such because of some of the things that I dealt in a childhood, and so that kind of started the cycle again. It
Interesting.
wasn't her fault, and I do not blame her one bit. It was never her fault. It was entirely mine. But I started to fall back into old habits slowly at first, and when I realized that it was starting to become like it was when I was a teenager, that's when I went to her because I knew that it could not get to the way it used to be, nor would I allow it to. And she, she can tell you her story later on. God told her that I used to struggle with that before we got married and that it would be okay. she took that to mean, oh, he'll never have that problem again. So when I came to her and said, I'm struggling again, and I told her about my childhood and whatnot, she was so kind and so loving, because I was ready at that point to say, I will accept it if you do not want to be married to me anymore. That's the point I had to get to be okay with that before I came to her, because I knew that was a possible outcome. And I loved her so much, I would have accepted that. And she and I worked together for a good year to, repair hurts, to figure things out. She knew I was contrite because I came to her. It wasn't something that I was trying to hide. It was, I'm falling back into this pit. I need help. And I'm like, if I can't get help from my wife, who can I get help from? And so she worked with me, stayed with me, and she can share her side of the story. But there was only a few relapses after, but we got to the point where it didn't become a problem anymore. So we worked through it, and it took a while, but that was because we were both willing to do that. And she knew that that was not something I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to hide it. I wasn't trying to um, pretend like it wasn't a problem. I knew the problem that it was, and when it scared me when it came back, um, and I didn't want it in my life anymore. And I prayed to God that He would take it away. He had another plan for me. He had another avenue beyond the spiritual that I eventually came to understand later on. Some of the physical aspects of why all men struggle with pornography. And we actually take these approaches to help other young men and other men like me who are struggling even today to have armor in the battle against this, because it's both a spiritual and a physical battle. Um, we were given answers, and that's why I learned that the Lord didn't just take it away from me. He gave me answers to help other people as well, because a lot of the spiritual things that you have to deal with are very personal. It can be past trauma. It can be, loneliness. It can be a variety of things. I don't think there's any one spiritual aspect to it, um, or underlying problems spiritually. There's a whole host of them, but there are some very universal physical aspects that can be helped with it as well.
Okay, can you maybe let's take I know people don't like talking about porn, but I like talking about it because I want people to see that they can overcome. So maybe let's take 10 minutes and just if you could tell us some of the tips that you used and even like the dynamic in your marriage, like what tips would you give other young couples that are facing the same thing?
So, as far as the spiritual, you definitely have to see what it is that you are dealing with that is causing you to seek relief from this, because in a way, the spiritual suffering that you're having, be it loneliness or rejection or whatever those aspects are, um, that's one part of the battle, and Satan is always right there next to you, ready to push you in that direction. um, Sometimes just talking to somebody and knowing that there's hope, is enough to say, okay, this is a battle I can win. I don't think a lot of young men or even adults my age know that it's a battle you can win. I think they just give up, and giving up is the worst thing you can do. Because then God can't help you when you give up. Then where are you going to go for any relief? He is the one that can help you through that process, as He did with me. As far as the physical side goes, we discovered that there's a lot of things in food that trigger the brain chemistry. Food is a big issue today. You got to throw away your Doritos. You got to throw away you
Yes.
got to throw away the junk food. It fundamentally comes down to a couple of chemicals, glutamate and dextrin, that are 80, 90% of the food that we eat.
Mhm.
And I and my wife became experts over the last 10 years regarding how to look for those things in food. It's difficult because you have to change your diet. But if you really want to, you have to eliminate some of those things because they're triggers. They actually trigger a chemical release that causes that looking for dopamine hits, that excitatory neurotransmitters. I don't want to get into too much detail. We have whole classes on this, and we've got lectures and things that we talk to people about how to cut out glutamate and dextrin. I mean, dextrin is almost in all candy, and maltodextrin and things like that. Glutamate, man, it's crazy, and the long list of food that it's in. So we have a fairly clean diet to the point where it's nowhere in it, and that is such a large part of the battle. I remember when we first discovered some of these things and implemented them. There's a program here in Utah where they help young men and adults in addiction recovery, specifically for pornography. I talked with the head of that program about what we had learned, and I said, I'd love to talk to you and implement this. His response to me was, I worry that we make it too easy if we do this. I'm like, what do you mean make it too easy for them? Like, what are you talking about? Like in his mind, he thought, well, that's too easy of a solution. And he was a therapist that was running this program. I was thoroughly confused. I'm like, here, I'm offering you instruction, understanding that you can incorporate into your program to help these young men not poison themselves with this food that is causing, it's not the fundamental cause, but it is a big part of triggering that. And he just said, you know what, no, we're not interested. I just don't want it to be too easy. That shocked me. I was blown away. um
Yeah.
so I I still doesn't make sense to me. In fact, I had an experience. I hate to say I had an experience with Satan, but I did. As we started implementing this, I was able to start hearing the Spirit's voice, my own voice, and Satan's voice very clearly from one another. I can distinguish all three of them now from one another.
Mhm.
There is a certain clarity that comes from eating right and
Yes.
having your mind be right. He told me that I was cheating. He told me I was cheating
What?
because I wasn't playing fair. He seriously wanted me to go back to not playing fair. I it's
Oh.
so funny when I tell people this, they're like, "Are you, what are you talking about?" I'm like, these were the thoughts that came into my head, and I knew they came from him, and he accused me of cheating because he was done having any power at that point forward over me, any physical or spiritual power, because the body and the spirit were put back into alignment, and they weren't fighting each other anymore. They were working together. So
That is so
I
awesome.
yeah,
Like, that's okay. I didn't expect you to say food. I'm a huge food nerd. Like, anybody that knows me personally knows I'm like, "Is it organic? Is it organic? Are you eating" Like, that's just who I am, and so that makes so much sense because of all the junk that they put in food. Who knew? That's so awesome. I
yeah.
mean, like, it's not awesome that they're putting terrible things in our food, but I didn't even realize. But you're right. That makes so much sense.
I used to be horrible at it. My wife was always the health person in our family, even in the early parts of our marriage. It took me looking at the science, and fundamentally, a lot of these answers came because we were trying to help our autistic daughter. She had a lot of health and mental issues growing up, and answers that we found for her helped me and others. Because even after I overcame the spiritual side of pornography addiction, there was still that physical side. I was still eating some of that junk food. When I saw what it was doing to my daughter and how it was affecting her, and then we changed. I mean, we didn't just change the food for our daughter. We changed all of our food for everyone in the family.
Mhm.
And when that started coming about, I was sold. I'm even more vigilant than most anybody because I had to see and feel the effects and know, not just scientifically, but feel it. to the point where my kids are so vigilant about what they eat because they don't want to feel terrible. They don't want to feel out of control. They don't want to feel this disruption that comes when our bodies. God knows how our bodies works, and He gave us knowledge and instruction. And now today, He knew that people were just going to be poisoning the food and putting all sorts of things in it, and it really disrupts us to the point where you have to be vigilant. It may seem like it's overwhelming to implement those things at first, but it's worth it. It's worth it, especially when you can have peace in your life and you don't have to fight for that peace. It just comes naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. I say this to people and they think I'm crazy, but seriously, if you want to get closer to God, eat right. Like that sounds so simple, but
Yeah.
really like it affects our ability to feel the spirit when our bodies and our spirits are connected. And I believe that the spirit is stronger than the body. So can you overcome just by the spirit? Yeah, you can, but it's so much better if your body is in alignment with the spirit. So eat better. Like, oh, if I could get that message to the whole world, that is a hill I will die on. Like, so much. So thank you. I did not expect you to say that. That's awesome. Okay, so let's kind of move on from this topic and kind of let's get into your awakening journey. So like what's like your step 1? Like what happened? You were obviously very faithful member, very close relationship with Christ. So what happened? What was step 1 in your awakening journey?
Well, looking back on it now, there were always these little signs, but I just got used to ignoring them, right?
Mhm.
From childhood through adulthood. You know, everybody always makes the excuse, well, the members aren't perfect. That's fine. I can deal with imperfect members, but an institution that doesn't protect its members and is in fact actively working against protecting it in the way that I see the policy that they implement or don't implement, that was that was where the wall started crumbling down. It really, I would say, the first break was when I started having some major callings in the church, being in the high council, being a ward mission leader, being a financial clerk. These were when I got to peek behind the curtain a little bit administratively, because up until that point, you were really just dealing with members and leaders and um, and you would give them charity, you would give them understanding, you would set boundaries. You really wouldn't judge the church based upon the what individual members were doing. But when you started getting to the administrative side of it, that's when I started seeing a whole different side. You know, as a financial clerk, I still remember I didn't get much training, but you know the training I did get, you can't be off by a penny when you are doing tithing. They were so stringent about making sure that all the financials, which is hilarious when we think of what happened obviously recently,
Mhm.
but the they they had that system down when it came to tithing, and they trained you on that, and there was no wiggle room in that. And so that was one of those things where I didn't really have a problem with it in doing being the financial clerk, but that's when the ward clerk and the bishop started creating a lot of confusion. I was saying, where does my role start? Where does his role start? He's like, well, you two need to work that out. So I sat down with them, and he's just like, well, we'll just figure it out. I'm like, no, because we're overlapping, and there were some issues that he tried to throw on me because he was doing work, wouldn't tell me I was doing some work. And so, you know, the ward clerk ultimately has the final say on everything, but the financial clerk is mostly support. I just said, look, where does my boundary begin and end? He couldn't define that, and it caused some trouble. Ironically, I didn't really like him that much, and it wasn't a personal thing. He just gave off this vibe. Found out later that during the time that he was serving as a ward clerk, he was committing adultery. He had some darkness about him that I couldn't explain at first. Um, but here's where I think it finally broke for me. we moved after a number of years to a new ward that we were at for about 10 years. As soon as I moved into the ward, they assigned me a home teaching companion back in the day when it was called home teaching. Immediately, the Spirit told me, you are not to let that man enter into your home. And I was a little confused at first. I'm just like, okay. I mean, I've been used to the Spirit telling me things in the past, but this was something that came very strongly. So I went to the elders quorum president. I was brand new in the ward, wanted to make a good impression, didn't want anybody to think that I was, making waves or anything like that. And I told him, I said, I'm sorry, the person you just assigned me, he can't be he can't be my companion. The Spirit told me that he can't be it. And then he turned to me, and this is what he said. He's just like, yeah, some people just can't escape their past and their past issues. I was like, what do you mean past and past issues? I told my wife this when I came home. She's like, I know what that means. And she immediately went up and looked at the registry for sex offenders. And there he was. And I didn't know, but the Spirit, because I had young daughters in my home, they
Right.
were 6 and 10 years old. And the fact that he knew, and that he knew the ages of my children, he knew his past, and that he assigned me and didn't tell me, that I think was the first break where I'm like, you're not even trying to protect people, especially my daughters. It it was the first kink in the chain, and it was a big one because I have had experiences since where I realized there's just no protection. They do not even make an effort to protect people. Years later, when we moved into another ward, they immediately called me to the primary, and you're like, you don't even know me. You haven't done a back. Like, I know I'm a good person, but you don't even know me, and you're immediately throwing me into the primary without anything else. And so it was one of those things where, and even now, with my daughters, I'm still in the church, and I even still go to church with her at times. And some people look at me because they know that I'm not a member, that I've left, and they're like, "Why are you here?" I'm like, "That's a good question. You know, why am I here?" And I just, yeah, it that was the first break. When I was in the High Council, I saw a lot of, I'm over you, so obey me. I'm the senior person here, so do what I say. Don't question it. I even got reprimanded a couple of times in being in the High Council just because I didn't get some information that they needed for the meeting, and I should have gotten that information. So it wasn't great in the leadership. When you get behind the scenes, you see that it literally is this mentality of, I'm senior above you. I'm telling you what to do. You do it. Um, and that just kind of trickles down through the process.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I think my dad, when he served as bishop, he saw that a lot too, where there's no safety for people in the church and you just do what you're told. And that's a really big issue because I think there's more safety in the church for people who are committing grievous abominations. There's more safety for them than there is
yeah,
for the innocent and the weak who need to be protected. And that floors me. And people get so mad when I say these things because they think I just left the church because I'm mad. And I'm like, no, I left the church because I don't want my future daughters to be abused.
yeah,
Okay. Or my future sons. Like, that's
yeah,
why. Like, there's so many solid reasons, but people, they just want to turn a blind eye to it until it directly affects them. And then that wakes you up a bit. So,
yeah. In that same ward, we had problems because we taught our kids to set boundaries with adults. Adults do not like kids setting boundaries with them,
no,
and especially in the youth
especially in the
program.
church. Like,
Yeah, especially in the church. Our youth, our young women in that ward went from about 10 active young women down to 2 because the leaders didn't care if they were there. They were in their position of authority. They're like, you just come. You just come to the activities. That's what you do. We don't care if you want to be here at the activities. You just come to the activities. And so it was one of those things where it was about that time that my kids started going inactive. I didn't pressure them to go to church. My wife and I still went, and even my daughter that still goes, she was going to church with us, but she did not go to Young Women's. She refused to. She's just like that. This is we taught her even to set boundaries with us at her as her parents, and today adults see that as very offensive when a child's like, no, no, thank you. I have my personal boundaries, and this is what I'm going to do, and especially in the church. I don't see that as big of a problem out in public when a child sets boundaries, but in the church, it all of a sudden becomes a big deal. And even the bishop was telling us that we should just sweep these things under the rug that we have problems with the young women. He didn't know how to deal with them. I know his past. I knew him and knew what he grew up with, and that was his solution, would just sweep things under the rug. But that's how he bishoped as well, was just, let's just move past this and forget about it. I'm like, but you can't ignore these problems. You have to deal with them because this is the result. People get hurt. People lose faith in other people, and especially if they idolize certain leaders, they're going to look at them and be like, well, this is an example of Christ. I don't want anything to do with that. I mean, I've unfortunately seen people leave the church and their faith in Christ because of the examples of those supposedly representing Christ in the church.
Yeah, it's a big deal. If we just learned how to approach people and their wounds in the way that Jesus would, people would feel better and they would feel safer. But there's even a whole generation of adults in the church now that don't respect boundaries and they don't want to, because the
Yeah.
church teaches you don't have to. And is it something that they say out loud? No, but it's a big cultural behavior that many people have. And so, is the church the reason for all of our problems? No. But does it have problems? Yes, it does.
Yeah,
And it's okay to talk about these things,
absolutely.
because I just want to see people doing better in the church, out of the church. Like, we should be protecting the weak. We should be caring for the weak, the innocent. Like, and it's not happening in society. It's not happening in the church anymore.
Yeah. Well, and that was the thing too that struggled when I was the ward mission leader. We came up with a ward mission plan that it basically covered two concepts, to basically look after the fatherless and the widow, just as it said, pure religion undefiled in James.
Mhm.
My understanding of the fatherless and the widow, Christ is the bridegroom. We are the bride. So the widow are those that are estranged from Christ, and the fatherless are those that do not have God in their lives. So my ward mission plan was to help people go to God and Christ, and it was rejected by the stake level. They wanted numbers. They didn't want work and effort. They wanted numbers to go by. I even fought with the high councilman, the very high councilman that replaced me when I asked to be released from the high council because I couldn't work within the system at that point. My wife had health issues too, and so I put my family first and told them they needed to release me. It took them forever, but I said, not of any unworthiness of my own, but I need to take care of my family. The high priest or the high councilman that replaced me, he and I fought all the time because they would not accept the ward mission plan of bringing people to God and Jesus. So,
So sad. Well, and I served in a Relief Society presidency in the singles ward, and I was told when I wanted to do things that brought people closer to God, I was told, you don't want to make it too churchy because people won't come. I was like, are we not a church?
yeah.
But nobody, like, that didn't phase anybody. It couldn't be too churchy because we were young single adults, and you can't be too churchy if you're a young single adult apparently. And that bothered me. And
Yeah, I bet.
when we can throw it under the rug, but it's not helping people come to know God. And I love your definition of the fatherless and the widows. Absolutely. That's absolutely how we should look at that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, the plan was borderless. It wasn't member and non-member. It was community.
Yeah.
That was the word mission plan. And it
Mhm.
wasn't about baptism and numbers. It was about bringing people to God and Jesus. And they didn't want that. Ironically, the previous ward mission leader before me, I talked to them later on. He's like, that was the same plan God told me to do. not in the same words, but that was what he wanted him to just build up the community and not worry about baptisms, not worry about numbers. And he left that too. And that's when I came in. And so they had two witnesses in that ward for what God wanted for it, and they rejected it.
Yeah. Yep. And then that's happening more and more in the church. So you're not an isolated story for sure. Okay.
Yeah,
So what next? Like, what did you do as you're experiencing all these experiences? Your records are removed now, right?
they are.
Okay. So how did you get from point A to point B? How did that happen?
So that's a good one. We had an opportunity to sell our home and move to be able to move forward in our progression, and and so we found ourselves in a new ward for about a year. And it was a nice ward, one of the best we've been in Utah for almost 25 years. It was one of the best wards ever, which was really interesting that that was the ward we ended up leaving in, because it wasn't about the ward. It wasn't about that. It was about the church. And because we met some amazing people that we're still friends with, people who were also kind of pretending that they were in the church but had left, but still, like, one of those things where we gravitated towards these people only to find out later they're like, yeah, we left too. We're kind of here kind of as a community thing and whatnot. They hadn't removed their names from the records of the church, but they were fed up with it too. They're like, they had their own story. And it was about 6 months after we moved that first my wife was looking at, obviously, these problems in Arizona with the bishop and them not reporting the abuse in the church and all of those things. And we know this wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, from our past experience, we're like, this is just the one that bubbled to the surface. That's what's going on here. And she got to the point where she's just like, it doesn't matter that it didn't happen to my child. If it happened to any child, it happened to my child. And at that point, she was just like, I'm done. I'm done being in an organization that will not protect the weak, will not protect the helpless, will not protect those that Christ would protect and do everything in his power to protect. I mean, the church does these token little things that say that they are implementing it, like, oh, you can attend the meeting with your child. Oh, that's always been the rule, even though it hasn't. And I remember my wife and I took them up on that when we did our last temple interview before we left. It was a year before or two. They didn't know how to conduct the interview with both her and I in there. The member of the stake president was like, I've never conducted a temple recommend interview with two people in the room. I'm like, but isn't it the policy that you can go in with your spouse or with your child? They're like, yeah. So that just showed that they can create all the policy they want. They don't follow through with it. They're not trained. People aren't trained how to protect others. At that point, she said, I'm done with the church. Now, you have to understand how much courage it took my wife to say this, because she knew my background. She knew we were both born and raised in the church, but she knew how much the church meant to me. What she didn't know was I had already decided early on in our marriage that if she ever left the church, I would still love her the same. I would never leave her. It didn't matter to me, because if she wanted to get closer to God by leaving an institution that wasn't protecting the innocent, I was all for that. I wasn't quite ready, but I was almost there. And when she told me, I told her, I said, that's perfectly fine, and I support you in that. I need a few more weeks to kind of figure things out for myself and determine what my role moving forward is. At that point, I decided that I wasn't going to serve in any administrative parts of the church. I was done and fed up with it. But I really need to see, am I in this? What am I doing here? She actually wanted me to tell her a reason to stay, and I couldn't give her a reason to stay. So she's like, I'm done. I wish you could tell me and comfort me and say, this is where we need to stay. And I said, I can't. So that was a beautiful moment for us. Sometimes people talk about how difficult it is for one spouse to leave before another, or what it may be. I loved her so much and respected her so much that I respected her agency, and I knew it wasn't going to change anything. Even if I stayed in the church, it wasn't going to change anything. But I eventually got to the point where I decided I was done. And it was a period of time where we were actually very comfortable, which was interesting because there wasn't any turmoil going on in the ward. There wasn't anything that not like in the last ward where one might say you would have been perfectly reasonable to leave at that point when you were dealing with all of this. This was a very calm moment in our lives, but it gave me the calm and peace to be able to go to God and look at everything that I knew about the church, and I didn't just say, oh, this is what I heard. I went and looked things up. I looked at what was going on. I read the news that was available to us. I did all of that. And I looked, and I finally went to God and I said, what do I do? And I remember his answer very clearly. And it was interesting because I've had since people say, oh, God won't ever tell you to leave the church. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true or not. But what he told me was, I want you to be hot or cold. That's what he told me. And I knew exactly what that meant. It meant if I was to stay in the church, I was going to do everything I could to fight to protect those within it. I was going to be in the system. And I knew that what that would eventually lead to, it would lead to my expulsion. It would lead to the excommunication. It would make waves, but I would be okay with that. But the other alternative was, is this your life mission? Is this what you're here to do? I know some people that fight within the church, and I applaud them for their strength of staying in and fighting these things, because most of the changes that's happened in the church have been people inside fighting it who got X'd, and then the church made the adjustment, but they paid the price for it. So I decided that I was done. And then I went to my wife and I'm like, we can't just leave the church. We need to remove our names from the records. We need to be done. And I told her, I said, this isn't for you and me. This is for our children, because it was our way of showing them that we reject what the institution, the abuse in the institution, and the wrongdoing, and the systemic problem that they're going to encounter no matter where they go. It doesn't matter if it's Utah or any other state. It's still going to have its systemic problems. When we sat down and told our kids that we were leaving the church, we weren't sure what their reaction was going to be. I do remember my son, who was 18 at the time, because he was feeling pressure, not from us to go on a mission, but from the church, bishop, young men's leader, things like that. He wasn't even active, but they still were harassing him to go on a mission in the various wards. And he had this sigh of relief because he wanted to please us so much, because we talked about our missions. I talked about my mission, and my wife served at Temple Square. We talked about them all of our lives. And I think he just didn't think that he had a choice, especially because of the rhetoric that we heard during COVID and since, where they're like, no, you don't have your agency. You chose to do this at baptism. So I mean, I'm sure people have heard that rhetoric that's coming out now. I never grew up with the rhetoric that we didn't have agency in doing anything that we want. I mean, everyone has agency. But he felt so much pressure. He himself wasn't ready to serve a mission. And I said, that's fine. You decide. You don't. My father didn't serve a mission. He was a faithful member of the church. He never served a mission. We didn't look at him as if because he came from generational members as well. but circumstances made it so that he couldn't serve a mission. Nobody faulted him for that. So it wasn't something that we were looking at like, hey, this is your rite of passage. You have to go through this process. And at that point, I knew we had made the right decision because I realized for our children's sake, they were able to then say, it's okay to set these boundaries, even with something as large as the church organization, which means that they're going to be able to set boundaries in their life with other people who would seek to harm them or, or, you know, hurt them in any way. There's always times where we're going to be hurt, but we can at least set boundaries to minimize that hurt in our lives so that we can have healthy relationships. We have a quote, I know it's from someone who's a psychiatrist, but it's up on our wall. And boundaries are the distance at which I can love me and you simultaneously. So
I like that. I like that a lot. I have some really close friends that I'm close with their whole family, and their mom was just telling me the other day how she felt the same way, that the reason why God told her to leave the church at that time was for her children. And I'm like, that is not an isolated case. So, if the church and the people in the church are not doing things to protect the weak, God will protect the weak. And he always does. And he always will. And I think he's teaching those of us coming out of all this abuse and hurt, he's teaching us how to be protected and how he's protecting us. And that's very empowering. I loved what you said, that your wife said, where if it's somebody else's child, it's my child, because that's true community. When you have mothers like that, where they're looking out for their kids and everyone else's kids in the community, that's so beautiful. And that's like the vision I think all good parents would want for their families. And it's so unfortunate that that's not happening in the church. I wish it was happening in the church.
yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. That problem would have to be fixed from the top down.
Mhm.
It cannot be fixed from the bottom up.
Mhm.
Uh, we can do all that we can to protect our families and those that we have stewardship over, even to the point I have no regrets because when I see Jesus, I know he's not going to look at me and be like, you left my church to protect your family, that is not what he's not going to be disappointed in me for making that decision. Could I have stayed in and could I have fought? Absolutely. Was that my personal mission in this life? No. I have
Mhm.
other things that I'm here to do.
Yeah.
Um, other people to help, especially people that are overcoming pornography.
Mm.
I have I have so much experience and answers. We're never giving up on anybody that we know has that issue and comes to us for help.
Mhm.
And these aren't just fluffy answers. These are real answers. These are real solutions that you can try and will work. Um, and so, ironically, it took me a while. I had a soda addiction for quite a while. I never drank coffee in my life, and it wasn't until I left the church that I was still drinking soda because my body still needed something. I have a issue metabolizing certain things, so it craves carbs, it craves the high sugar and things like that. Our family grew up on sugar. We were sugar addicts.
My family too.
I
Yep.
understand why that is, and
Mhm.
it's horrible. But all of a sudden, the spirit, I have to tell you, after leaving the church, I've actually had more connection and inspiration from God than when I was in. I
Mhm.
know everybody says, no, that can't be. You can't leave the church and be more connected with God. I've had more personal revelation and understanding from Him in ways that I never thought I could have because I'm not worried about checking the right boxes or thinking the right thoughts in terms of what the philosophy of the church is today. It's what does God want me to know? What is truth? So I tried coffee for the first time and it instantly killed my soda addiction. I only drink one cup in the morning, more like a latte, just some because it's a little bitter, but I never drank coffee in my life. And so after leaving, all of a sudden, like being in the church withheld me from one of the health issues that I was dealing with. Because no one would say that high fructose corn syrup is good for you and have an addiction to be so. But you can have an addiction to soda and still pass the temple recommended review,
Hmm.
but you can't drink a cup of coffee and be okay. So I found it ironic that I had to leave the church before I was willing to branch out. And it took a lot of mental energy because I had been in it over 46 years, grew up in it, everything. I'm still deconstructing things. I'm trying to keep all the good in my life and change out and change things that are bad. And that was kind of one of the more recent things, was getting rid of the soda addiction. I haven't had soda since, and I don't crave sugar. I don't crave candy. I'm not a sugar addict anymore. And coffee is such a natural plant that God made. And I was just shaking my head still. Every time I drink my cup of coffee in the morning, I shake my head and be like, I was kept from answers because I was in the church. I was kept from seeking out some of these things that could help me personally because I was just told, don't do that. Don't, you know, oh, it's fine. You have your soda addiction, but don't drink coffee, you know?
Yeah, I think your message is very hopeful for a lot of people. I have many, many opinions about this podcast, specifically on Instagram. And a lot of people express how hard it is for them to leave the church because everybody's telling them that God has left them. And it's
Mhm.
a gaslighting tactic, and it's just not true. Like, as much as the church and its members want to make us think that we have lost God, they cannot take that away from us. You have not lost God's protection because you left a corporate institution. And your story illustrates this, as does
Yeah.
mine and many, many others, that you can still have God in your life. In fact, God really comes forth even more in your life when you just turn your life over to Him and give it to Him. And we see that in your story. So I just love everything that you're sharing because it's so hopeful for all of us in this place right now.
Yeah. In fact, that was one of the reasons why I was interested in coming up and sharing my story, because of the other stories that others have shared. And I'm like, this is my community. This is those that can distinguish between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ, of the LDS Church. Um, Not many people know that there was a talk given a while back in conference that they actually distinguished between the gospel and the church. And they made him re-record it. This was back in the days of VHS.
Mm.
And I've seen the videos side by side, and he made a clear distinction. This was, I think he was a 70, but he made a clear distinction between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the organization of the church. And they made him re record it to make it seem like they were one and the same. And they even put a cough track on it, because this was the days when they would send out the general conference talks,
Mhm.
and they'd be on VHS. So it was another form of gaslighting, because I'm sure some people probably watched it on the TV on those days. We didn't have digital recording; it was just all, streamed, and then you either have to record it yourself, which some people did, which is why we have that recording, and then the revised version that they sent out. And it was very deliberate. It was very deliberate that they didn't want the gospel and the church to seem like they were separate things.
Both the gospel of Jesus Christ and the church of Jesus Christ are true and divine. However, there is a distinction between them which is significant, and it is very important that this distinction be understood.
And there is an essential relationship between them that is significant and very important.
Of equal importance is understanding the essential relationship between the gospel and the church. Failure to distinguish between the two and to comprehend their proper relationship may lead to confusion and misplaced priorities, with unrealistic and therefore failed expectations. This in turn may result in diminished benefits and blessings, and in extreme instances even disaffection.
Understanding the proper relationship between the gospel and the church will prevent confusion, misplaced priorities, and failed expectations, and will lead to the realization of gospel goals through happy, fulfilling participation in the church. Such understanding will avoid possible disaffection and will result in great personal blessings.
As I attempt to describe and comment upon some distinguishing characteristics
the essential relationship between the
of the gospel and the
church,
church, noting at the same time their essential relationships, it is my prayer that a perspective may be developed which will enhance the influence of both the gospel and the church in our individual lives.
It was fascinating that it took me leaving the church to go down a rabbit hole. I didn't go down the rabbit hole while I was in church. I just saw where it was today, and I rejected where it was today. Then I started going down the rabbit hole. And you've had people say this before on your podcast, but the last thing that I found was that polygamy was not of God.
Me too. I was like, I am late to the party. Like,
Yeah, never was part of God. It was instituted by Brigham and others.
Mhm.
Joseph never taught it. So much evidence. Thank God for those who are online sharing this evidence, sifting through all the discovery of the Joseph Smith papers and all of the papers and all the historical records showing that Joseph Smith was a prophet, restored truths, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants in its original form, not its modified version today. All of these truths that brought us closer to God, as prophets are meant to do. They're meant to show you the way and then get out of the way so that you have a personal relationship. But the church has put itself in between us and them. For years, when my kids would come back from seminary, I'd say, "How was Pharisee school?" And they roll their eyes. They're like, "Dad." I'm like, "What else would you explain paid clergy of teaching you in the Utah institutions, the seminary?" I said, "I don't know any other way." This is while I was still a member of the church.
Right.
But that for me, I was like, I don't feel that is right, that men should be in between us and God. And that's how we've taught our children is we're here to tell you and teach you and share our experience. And then we get out of the way because you need to have that personal relationship with your Heavenly Father and with Jesus Christ. And we can't be in the way of that. If we are trying to put ourselves in the place of Christ, and that is not our place. That is none of our places.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I love that so much. James, this has been such a powerful episode. You've hit on so many important points. And, the work that's being done to bring forth the history is amazing. But then it's also amazing to hear stories like yours where we're seeing how the corruption in history is affecting us today. And it just comes full circle. And we see this is why we have to get out. This is why we have to escape into the wilderness because we're going to come to know God better in this wilderness place, even though it's hard. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. It's been empowering for me, and I know it's going to empower many others. So James, how do you find clarity in your life now?
One way in which I find clarity is living the Lord's true law of health through food that God intended for us to eat, and through spiritual food as well. Some of that spiritual food beyond the scriptures is being fed by God and Christ as we pursue them. Even God has healthy boundaries with us. If we approach him the wrong way, he tells us there's a boundary and you need to respect that boundary. And when we respect that boundary, he gets even closer to us. Too many times people think that boundaries are intrusive, but they're actually, they can bring a married couple together in ways that you can't imagine. And if you center Christ in your relationships, especially in your marriage, this is the reason why my wife and I are almost 25 years married, and we have peace and harmony in our home. Christ is the gatekeeper, and he employs no servant there, which means no one should stand in between us and him. So my clarity comes from putting him first in my life and not allowing anyone to get in between me and his healing power. because if we allow him to be included in our lives, we will have joy greater than we can imagine. So my clarity comes from allowing God into my life, allowing all the good into my life, and keeping all of the bad out of my life, which is why we've made these decisions throughout our life, is to always keep the good, leave the bad out. And we just keep getting stronger and stronger and have greater and greater joy.
I love that so much. Living God's true law of health and not letting anything come between you and God, and just holding on to the good and letting go of the bad. Thank you so much, James, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. If you guys are interested in coming on the podcast and sharing your story of how you have left the LDS Corporation to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com. You can also find us now on Instagram at the Clarity Podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.